Today I am delighted to be joined by Graham Norwood. Graham is a highly respected property journalist. He's a specialist in the field. He's a very, very busy man on the radio, on telly, writing books, writing goodness knows how many articles, and we're incredibly grateful for you, Graham, to give up your time and come and talk to me. Fantastic to see you. It's been a little while.
Thank you.
How long is it you've been involved in the property world?
I started writing precisely in the new millennium, when I've been working at the BBC before that time as a journalist in London. And actually I wanted to get out and be a freelance, and I wanted to move out of London. And I could see that what was developing slowly but surely then was a bit of a niche in terms of journalism as people's interest in property was growing.
Yes.
So I decided to specialise in that, hoping there might be something else I would fall back on if that didn't work out.
Okay.
But it's
still looking
sort
for
of grown and grown, and I'm still looking for something proper to do.
Where do you think your sort of passion for property stemmed from? So you trained as a journalist, thought you'd write about anything, but focused on property.
Yep. Well, when I was at the BBC, I did do a fair bit of business reporting, amongst other things. I was there at the BBC for quite a while. You'd end up doing quite a lot of things. So I did some business reporting, and that included in those days the total of interest in the property market, which really was only interest rate rises when they happened, or interest rate changes, and the Halifax and Nationwide Building Society indices. And that was just about it,
Really?
the beginning and end of anything really to do with residential property journalism.
And then along came location, and everybody...
Exactly. When in fact, as you know, all of these things grew within about 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And I think buy-to-let was just starting, so people were thinking about investing in property.
Yeah.
A lot of people had moved and found they made a lot of money out of property. I know those days have gone, but that was what was happening then.
But it made them feel good.
Exactly.
It was all paper money, but it was feel good.
It was a feel good, and they were encouraged to do more. And they suddenly realised that they could do a small amount of work, and the property would be worth a lot more, or they could move to a different area. So all of these things suddenly became subjects for stories.
And forgive me for asking, but how many stories? I mean, you are very, very prolific. How many stories might you write a week or a day?
Well, the reason I'm prolific is that I do both trade property journalism for estate agents and letting agents, and I do consumer-facing property journalism for normal people, so to speak. So for the trade, I write typically up to about 10 shortish stories each weekday. And that's quite important because those industries are really active, competitive, and interesting. So I do those, and those are ready each midnight when Estate Agent Today goes live and Letting Agent Today goes live.
Okay.
And then over the course of a week, I might write 3 longer articles I write for the Telegraph and the Sunday Times and the Daily Mail. So consumer articles about all aspects really of property markets and locations.
So 3 major pieces a week and probably up to 50 industry shorter pieces.
Absolutely. There's a lot of bylines on the internet, even if I don't want them to be there.
And where do you go for your reliable data? Where does it?
Well, it obviously depends who and what I'm writing about, but broadly speaking, if I'm looking at housing markets, which are quite a lot of what I write about, really essentially it's about housing markets. There are some key indices that I use. There's the Government Land Registry Official Government Index, which is a little bit dated when it comes out, but it's very, very reliable. There are those 2 indices that still exist, Nationwide and Halifax.
Others are available.
Absolutely. Many others are available. Almost one a day now is available. And actually I use, and I'm not saying this because I'm speaking to a former buying agent, but I use buying agents quite a bit because I find they often give, if you choose the right buying agent, they often give a very balanced view of what's happened in the market.
Well, they're not lending any money and they're not selling any houses, so there's...
Well, that's correct. I mean, you could say that they also have a vested interest in talking the market down because they obviously want to get the most competitive price for their clients. But I do think that if you pick and choose carefully, they often have the best, the most balanced view. But something you can't beat, even though there's a huge amount of data around for everybody now on the internet in particular, what you can't beat is actually speaking to people in a specific area.
Yeah.
So if I'm writing about something, whether it's prime central London or the middle of Dartmoor, I try to talk to some agents who are working in those particular areas because they really know what's going on in a way that an automated market valuation online can't really tell you.
I'm glad to hear you say that because I travel the country a lot in my work, and people read the headlines or the national reports and say, well, this is happening in the market. But actually, as you say, you've got to understand what's happening in your local market to the price bracket of your particular type of property, and it's really that polarised, isn't it?
That's right. There's an endless amount of data that will tell you, you know, how much properties on average sold in a whole postcode. But I know from where I live that my street is very different to the street next door. My house is not the same as the houses elsewhere in the street. So you really do need to speak to people with a bit of expertise. Now, at the same time, you have to acknowledge that the reader of quite a lot of these articles want to get a broad brush view of what an area is like, or whether the market is going up or down or staying roughly still. So you don't want to bog them down in too much detail, but you need to be accurate.
On that topic, Graham, do you feel that the media has a role to play in its impact in the market, because it's a very sentiment-driven thing, the housing market? Do you feel that you report on sentiment, or do you create sentiment, or is it somewhere between the two?
Well, I would say that certainly at the start, you report on sentiment, because clearly quite a lot of articles are triggered by something that happens before the journalist has ever said anything or reported anything. So if a price index suggests prices are moving spectacularly in one area or another, or there's a particular location that appears to have a good reason why it's going to be a hotspot in the next 6 months, then you start writing about it because something outside has happened. But of course, if you have multiple journalists writing it, and you know, journalism is a competitive field like estate agency and lots of other businesses, if you have multiple journalists writing it, then people will keep reading that this particular location is the place to buy, or these prices are falling in somewhere else. So I can't help thinking we add to the momentum at that point.
Which comes with a certain degree of responsibility, particularly for yourself, Graham, because you really have been specialising in this industry for longer than anybody else, and more prolific than anybody else. So you are a highly respected person in your world. So I'm sure a lot of other journalists will read your pieces and go, well, Graham says this is happening. We better copy on.
Yes, I mean, there clearly is a responsibility, and you have a responsibility in two ways. I think firstly, you've got a responsibility to the reader to get something correct, and secondly, you have a responsibility to anybody you feature in an article, because a lot of articles, a lot of the newspapers in particular, or their online versions now, they want individual examples to illustrate a point. So if you are speaking to somebody whose property is just going on sale somewhere where prices may be falling, or it may be the sort of property that's proving difficult to sell, then you've got a responsibility not to, put them in a really difficult, embarrassing, awkward, or financially disadvantageous position. So you've got to sort of tread a thin line. But the essential guide really is, if you're telling it as it is, then you've got a sort of an ultimate defence, really.
Yes. What would you say are the big challenges ahead for buyers and sellers in the market? Because there's lots of uncertainty at the moment, naturally, and people are kind of sitting on the fence a little bit. Where do you think the great challenges?
Well, I guess in the short term, there is the decision whether you are actually going to buy or sell, and I think that's very much a personal decision based on people's circumstances and what their advisors say, and those advisors can be family members or estate agents or whatever. But I think once you do make the decision, I think probably more important than ever before is getting the estate agent right, because I've been writing about property, as you have alluded, for about 20 years now, and I don't think I've known a time where, just speaking to people anecdotally, the valuations they receive from estate agents, the prices that are put on their properties have varied quite as much as they do now.
Right.
And also there's a lot of competition
Yes.
between the agents, so there's undoubtedly a temptation for the agents to try to win instructions by being a bit ambitious on the prices that they put on properties. So you need to be very careful, just on a micro level.
Yeah.
A buyer or seller needs to be very careful where they get their advice from.
It's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because if somewhere goes on with a too ambitious price, buyers aren't stupid, and neither are their surveyors or their banks.
Yeah.
So it ends up spending a long time on the market. I call it they get burned.
Yeah.
And then months later, the price has to be slashed, and it just looks terrible. It was bad advice at the beginning.
Yeah. There's always been a huge variation in how quickly or otherwise some properties have sold, and sometimes it's accident and happenstance and not because people really get it right or get it wrong. But it is quite interesting, throughout, whether you're looking at central London or whether you're looking in the middle of the country, some properties really have been on sale for years. And a lot of people suggest that only about half the number of properties that are listed on the property portals actually succeed in selling. So, there's an awful lot of stuff out there which one way or another gets it wrong.
I'm interested as to how things are likely to take shape in the next year or two. Because it feels to me transaction volumes have been so low. People haven't been moving, understandably, uncertainty. No one wants to make a big move, financial decision in a time where they don't know, where the boundaries are. But life's continued. People have got married and got divorced and had babies and changed schools and got new jobs and died and all of the things that generally motivate housing market. That's all been continuing, but people haven't been moving. So presumably, in my small brain, I kind of think, well, they're going to move. Life goes on, and they can't kind of put that off forever. I call it a Brexit bounce. Do you think it's possible?
I think it's absolutely possible. My gut feeling, and I don't think anybody can point to solid evidence here, but my gut feeling is I think sentiment in a longer term way has actually changed about property, and I don't think there are that many people who are sort of really itching to go and are just waiting for a key vote in the House of Commons or a key general election or something else to give them that push. I think quite a lot of people these days look on property in a way that they didn't 10 years ago. 10 years ago, if you weren't making money each year from your property and you couldn't somehow measure it, then a lot of people felt actually they weren't getting the most out of their house. An awful lot of people now, I think, look on their house as, sure, if they can make money, that's great. But actually, they want it in the right place, the right size, and right for their family or their own needs or what they want to do later in life. And I think a lot of people are changing their houses. And by that I mean extending them, using them in different ways. We are working more flexibly than we ever have before. I think a lot of people are treating their house as a home and not treating their house as an asset and a home in the way in which they did a few years ago. So, given how expensive it is to move, quite often, a lot of people, even once we've got this uncertainty out of the way, assuming that ever happens before we're all dead, once that's done, I'm not convinced there'll be a huge number of people moving that have been waiting to do so.
I mean, after all, it's good advice. It's something I've been talking for 20 odd years, is buy a home for the long term. And the homes that I love best and the homes that suit buyers best are those ones that can be adapted as a family's needs evolve, and families' needs do evolve. You start using a house in a different way, and then teenagers and hobbies, and it naturally evolves. So if you live in a house that can be adapted to suit, then so much the better.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, quite a lot of people don't, and I know that there is a well-defined sort of trail as people get older and they get married or get a partner, and then when they get children, and then when those children need education, and then when they need higher education, and then when they leave home completely. I know there is this pathway, and that is clearly a pattern in how many people live their lives and buy their homes accordingly. But increasingly, I think people are changing things. I mean, we can all draw on our personal experiences, but I moved into a house where we removed a couple of bedrooms in order to have 2 home offices for my wife and myself, so that we could because we each work,
and you can put those walls back up if you wanted to sell.
Exactly. So we bought a house that was bigger than we needed in strict terms, and now we we've sort of reduced its livability to
Yeah.
the size of the family.
Yeah.
And as you say, we can expand it upwards. And I think a lot of people are doing that in their own
Yeah.
ways to meet their own needs.
There definitely are changes in society, and if you look throughout history, that's par for the course. What do you feel about generation rent and perhaps the younger generation's thoughts on home ownership or not?
Yeah, I think to use a fashionable term, I think a lot of what young people feel about renting has been weaponised, and I think people who are renting want the best circumstances, whether that's the fairest rent or the best quality property, and that's always been the case, I think, and I'm sure it always will be the case. I think quite a lot of politicians have, of all political persuasions actually, have taken that on, and rather than look at a longer term solution for housing difficulties, like increasing the sheer number of homes we've got, they've taken the issue of renters, and in a bid to get a younger population on their side, they've taken quite an aggressive anti-landlord, anti-letting agent sort of line. So to get back to your specifics of your question, I'm not sure that generation rent is as agitated and angry as some of their political spokespeople might suggest. But if you're saying that, are people my age responsible or partly responsible for people half my age not being able to buy because of affordability, then I have to put my hands up. And I think the older generation does have that level of responsibility. But there's more than one way to address that. And I think for politicians, the way to address that is to increase the house building that we have in this country.
Yeah. And of course, the way to tackle that is to have a much longer term housing policy. A 5 or 6 year governmental term housing policy is never going to cure it.
Absolutely, and it's even worse than that, because as you know, housing ministers go almost every few months. And
we can't pull ourselves out of a crisis on short term.
Exactly. And also, and I've suggested in the past, and you have, and I think many other people in the industry have thought, look, there are some circumstances where there is almost a completely national consensual view about things. And there must surely be a national consensual view that most people should have decent quality housing, and that if they want to buy, they should be able to buy, and affordability shouldn't be, completely stopping them. And there should be something like all-party agreement about that.
It should be.
And it shouldn't be too
It's a
difficult
national
to achieve.
issue. It's a national crisis.
Because actually, if you break down all of what the individual parties are saying, there's actually, although they dress it up in a lot of partisan difference, there are a lot of similarities. And if only they could, ring fence this item and say, this is so important that we're going to work together on this, or we're going to carry out a programme that is much the same, whoever is in power, over a long period of time, then we'd achieve it.
Come on, Graham, make it happen.
I know.
Come on, you can do it. You're the man for the job.
Right. You can be in the photograph. I'll write the words. That would be great.
I couldn't agree with you more. We need a kind of 25-year policy that everybody signs up to.
Absolutely, and also things that sometimes are regarded as stigmatised or old-fashioned or whatever, as part of multi-tenure. We should have, there's nothing essentially wrong with council housing. There's a 21st century interpretation of things, which is much better than the 20th century interpretation. We do all sorts of things now in a better way than the way we did it 50 or 75 years ago. And the old stigma and difficulties that surrounded council housing don't have to be repeated. And that would be a really fantastic way of kick-starting building the housing stock and having private rented, a mixture of private rented. We've got individual landlords who have their buy-to-lets, but we also have build to rent. We have institutions coming in. There's plenty of room for all of these because, controversially, I would say we've got enough land to build these, but also we've certainly got the demand for them.
Can I pick up on that topic a minute? Because it's something that's been in my mind. It's across the channel, you can have a long lease, a long tenancy, a guaranteed, secure, long tenancy. And people are much happier to rent. In fact, very few of them own their own homes. They rent off institutions and they settle in. They go, this is home, this is my community, this is where I'm going to put my kids to school, this is life. And that seems to work really well.
I can't see anybody who would lose out of that. The older people would have a better choice, and they'd be able to use some of the assets that they've built up, equity they built up in their house. Landlords would benefit from it because they'd have a very reliable tenant, and demographics and society would benefit from
Housing market benefits.
Exactly.
That's a win-win.
Larger properties would suddenly become available for younger families.
Win-win all the way around.
I know. I think we definitely ought to run for this joint housing minister position.
There's been a lot of legislative changes in the rental market, probably over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
Do you think that's all? Do you think they're all good news for the tenants?
Well, put it this way, most of them certainly have been introduced, and I think probably quite sincerely by the politicians. They've been introduced with the tag of them being good news for tenants. There is the classic stuff of unintended consequences.
That's what I'm interested in.
And, you know, we've got the most controversial, probably, or at least the highest profile change that's been introduced of late, 2 of them. One was to do with tax breaks for buy-to-let mortgages, and the second to do with letting agents' fees. And I think, whilst on paper this sounds absolutely great, and you can imagine the Downing Street policy wonks around a table, and they had this fantastic presentation. But the problem with that is, if you get rid of buy-to-let landlords from certain properties, then you have fewer properties for tenants to rent.
And
the rents go up.
And then they can't buy anything.
Absolutely. And then letting agents' fees are banned or heavily restricted. And it is undoubtedly the case, and I don't think anybody should confuse my concern about this ban. I don't think anybody should confuse that with accepting that some letting agents were not, were being very unfair and were really taking advantage of it. But if somebody has to pay for some of these things that letting agents do, and if it's not going to be the tenant, then it's going to be the landlord. And we go back again, and the landlord is going to put the rents up. So, we go round in a circular argument with that. Now, I'm not saying that all of these changes are counterproductive, and I'm not saying that politicians didn't have good intentions for them.
But there are other implications.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's why it's a fascinating market to comment on, because there are so many variables, and you take one out and everything else changes.
That's right.
The whole picture changes.
And one thing that's quite interesting, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, I never wrote anything about renting. For consumer journalism. They weren't interested in it, it wasn't big. The people who rented, by and large, they probably weren't the typical readers of some of those newspapers. But now, everybody has got a vested interest in it, because even if they're not renting themselves, their son and daughter is probably renting because they can't afford to buy. So it's become not only a bigger tenure in its own right, but it's become a subject that so many more people are impacted by.
I've actually just made a whole series of podcasts about the rental market, because it has become more complicated and it has become more competitive as well. And people are making choices about where to have a home and set up a home. And they've got to understand their rights and their responsibilities, as well as the rights and responsibilities of the landlord. So
absolutely,
it's an interesting time.
And it's become more competitive, as you say, not only between landlords and what they offer, but this new build-to-rent concept, which clearly is still very small and is still very immature, if you like, in market terms. But one day that will be a significant contribution towards how we live.
Well, Spain, France, Germany, a lot of the property is owned by institutions, so it's a kind of similar model.
That's right.
Is there anything in your sort of opinion that is on the horizon for consumers? Anything that we're likely to see over the next?
Well, what I think will happen undoubtedly, and we've already had the first hints of this, is there's going to be a significant, I think a genuine and much needed improvement to the house buying process, which, now let's not be too harsh about it, about 1 million people a year manage to buy a house, and they don't buy houses often, so they manage to get through the process. So it's not completely riven with difficulty, but it is clearly going to become a little bit more transparent, I hope a lot quicker, and I think a lot more understandable for people. Because at the moment, there are, you get survey after survey of people who don't know what an exchange is compared to what a completion is, compared to what referral fees are, compared to anything else. They don't know what they're being charged for or when they pay certain things. And I think that's grown up because a lot of these individual elements started many, many decades ago, but they started at different times and they were added to the process.
Yeah.
They've now become slightly more complicated because there are so many competitors in the field offering mortgages, buying associated with estate agents or independent. Yeah. So that's become very complicated. And I think this government, over the past couple of years, has led an all-party discussion on how to improve that process. All parties in terms of political parties, but also involving estate agents, letting agents, mortgage companies, conveyancers and so on. A lot of people who previously were not quite at each other's throats, but were, they wanted to guard their own ground. And the government has come up with a few ideas, like putting down reservation fees on properties to try to minimise the number of times a deal falls through, giving more advance information to buyers so that they don't realise a problem at a late stage. All of these things are difficult. They're not as easy as they sound, but there has been some progress, and that, I think, will continue. So in 5 years' time, I think we'll be in a better place than we are now.
Thinking of the future, I know you've written a book, albeit a long time ago, about the way the housing market operates and that you've got a big interest in proptech. I think technology is making a lot of these changes perhaps more likely to happen and quicker to happen. But let's think forward, if we can, over the next 10 years. I mean, proptech is the buzzword of the moment. There's a lot of it around. Some's better than others, but it's certainly making a big impact, isn't it?
Yes, there's a lot of proptech. I think my reading of it, and I get a lot of information about a lot of products, is much of it is very good. Much of it is a solution to a problem nobody's identified yet. But nearly all of it is actually aimed at property professionals and those within the industry. And that's good, that's great, that makes the process easier to do, quicker, and so on. And we are already seeing some elements of house buying becoming a little bit quicker because of proptech. But I think the next few years we'll see it switch around, and it will be aimed much more at buyers, sellers, tenants. It's very difficult to foresee because, I think 10 years ago we wouldn't for 1 second have imagined the level of artificial intelligence and what's happening now. But I think you can certainly see some consumer trends. I mean, there's nothing bigger, I think, than the interest that certainly younger people have in the environment. And I think the way in which technology is used to gauge good houses, bad houses, good conditions, bad conditions. We have an energy performance certificate, as you know, that every buyer and every tenant sees before they move in. And generally speaking, my understanding is that they look at it and
they look
don't
at it,
quite put it there. They don't quite put it over the shoulder, but it's somewhere down an inch thick of paper. But I think more people will pay attention to that. And it is quite interesting. One of our recent housing ministers did float as an idea that in an age, in a few years' time, when there are a lot of smart meters in people's houses, why have a paper EPC when you could have an online one showing not what an assessor found on his or her visit to a property a year ago, but actually how much electricity has it used, how much solar gain has it got from its panels, and how much water is leaking there and everything else.
It's not that complicated. I mean, I'm sure there's sort of data issues and privacy issues, but actually having a kind of almost a logbook.
Exactly.
The efficiency of your car how many miles it does to go, and know before you buy it.
Yeah. The heartening thing I have to say is that this is one of that concept is one of the things that 1 or 2 estate agents are already being quite open about, and the government wants to do. I know, we all know 15 years ago or thereabouts, it was a hot potato, and a lot of estate agents in particular were not happy with too much information up front because they thought it might prejudice the sale, and I can see why they were worried about it. But I think automation has moved so much in that period of time that it's much more straightforward now, and I think people expect it. I mean, we all want to know whether our car that we're going to buy is energy efficient. No matter how much we may be sceptical of how the manufacturer measures this, we want to know that car A is more or less efficient than car B, and we make certain decisions on that basis. That will be how proptech will develop in the next 5 years.
I mean, it's heartening to hear you say those kind of things, because much of the reason behind me setting up the Move IQ website was to inform people at an early stage so they can make confident decisions that they then are happy with and they don't change their mind a month later because they've suddenly found something out about the property they didn't know. Actually, in this day and age, the data's there, the information is there. You need it to make a good decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all know instances where it's happened. I've got somebody who lives a few doors away from me who's just lost about £4,000 because somebody pulled out at the last minute for a reason that actually they could have known earlier on, and nobody deliberately sort of concealed it. But the process, as it's currently structured, means you don't find out some vital information until quite a long way down the road, and people lose out and they get embittered by it and everything else.
They should have brought one of my property reports.
Well, I know. I shall be telling them that.
Please do.
I'll be putting it through the door. Yeah.
Graham, real pleasure to spend some time with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil.